Yo, 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 good morning. Grateful for another maggot-free day above the dirt, Jersey Shore. Check it out. So today's video picks up where the last one kind of left off. It's a continuation of Buddhism is a conspiracy theory. So this is part two of that. And in the last video, the focus was more on how the teachings are a theory until we actually test them and have our own direct experience with them to see if they are something we want to engage or something we want to let go of, which is what the Buddha urged. Let go of teachings that don't serve you, engage the ones that do. So that was really the only focus. And I'm going to talk today about how, that video didn't address the fact that, most people just look at and accept Buddhism as it's presented to them, no questions asked, right? So the last video dealt with, just dealing with the teachings. Do they resonate? Do they work for us in our own journey? And only each one of us can decide that. What works for me might not work for you. And that's fine. So this video deals with, what is this Buddhism we're accepting at face value, no questions asked? And I understand sometimes we have to have a little faith and believe in something to try it, right? But that's not really belief. It's really curiosity that we need to satisfy. And the satisfaction is either we conclude it's right or wrong for us, and that's it. So this video is really about that Buddhism itself is a major conspiracy theory, not one that we prove right or wrong by our own practice and teachings, but just understanding that Buddhism itself, the Buddha didn't sit down and said, I'm going to start Buddhism, right? The Buddha was steeped in the teachings of the time, right? Of the cultural trappings of his time. And he was a spiritual aspirant that decided what he was engaged in was helpful, foundational, but it didn't get him where he wanted to go. And what he did was he looked at the religious practices of the time and said, you know what? He found what teachings resonated with him, and he took those and isolated them and created a practice that worked for him, right? This is why, you see the Four Noble Truths, the nature of suffering, talk about sense pleasure and pursuing and avoiding. That's all in Hinduism, right? But what he did was he said, this works for me, that doesn't work for me. I'm going to take what works for me in support of what I'm trying to achieve and do it. He didn't want to teach, began teaching anyway, thinking no one would understand it. People got it, and people created Buddhism. Buddhism's actually a modern term by Eastern Europeans, that went there and put a Judeo-Christian model on what they witnessed without knowing. So they're part of this conspiracy theory. Buddhism also assimilated into other countries, and in that assimilation picked up folk stories, folk religion beliefs, cultural beliefs of each country it entered, and it shifted. Now that's not good or bad, right or wrong, it just is. So Buddhism that we accept on face value is just a theory as well, because honestly, again, going back to, I don't know. I don't really know what the Buddha said and what he didn't say. I don't know if a teaching that's resonating with me was spoken by a devotee, 100 years later. I don't know if what's written in the books are factual or not. You know, they could be absolutely metaphorically, but, you know, for me to say this happened and this was true, I didn't experience it. So that is the slippery slope for me personally with a dogmatic religion and a spiritual philosophy or a spiritual action, which is where I side with more. I've come in my practice to accept a lot of the religiosity of Buddhism as important in a metaphorical sense, as a teaching lesson sense. But for me personally, I recognize I really don't know much about what's true and not true in terms of what people call Buddhism. There's scholars arguing over this for you know, years. Was the Buddha even one person, or is it a composite? Most tend to say he was a person, but then they have the argument about whether there's a supernatural, esoteric aspect to that, or just a person that sat down and, you know, became mindful and taught that. You know, Bodhidharma going to China from India, a lot of scholars feel that's a composite of many different Indian monks, not just one person. You know, so all of this that is presented as fact, the reality is, not only do I not know it's fact if I haven't experienced it, but the people presenting it, and the people before them, and the people before them, and you know, things get, we've all played that telephone game where the message in the beginning is much different at the end. And you know, we have a lot of people drawing lines in the sand about what's traditional and authentic and what's not. And the irony here is most of the Buddhist conservatives that tout this line of what's authentic and traditional are really drawing a line in the sand about stuff that was added from other cultures and other religions much later. So it's really not traditional or authentic in the sense of they don't, not only can we not say it came from the Buddha, but we can actually say, hey, this is part of the Bon religion in Tibet that came into Buddhism, or this is part of Taoism or Shintoism that's finding its way into Japanese Buddhism, and so on. So the irony is the Buddha, and you know, a lot of people there's this line between, you know, traditional Buddhism and mindfulness, and how traditional Buddhists say the mindfulness crowd is stripping Buddhism of its I don't even know what the word is to call it, but it's stripping Buddhism of its authenticity, of its traditionalism, of the esoteric, supernatural aspect of it. And those are my words, not theirs. But the irony is, the Buddha stepped out of traditional religion at the time and did something different, just like the mindfulness people are stepping out of Buddhism, you know, now, and have been for many years. So who's to say what's more authentic or not? And I'm here to say, I can only say what's authentic for me. I can only say what I know about me and myself and my experience. So, you know, the Buddha was the first revolutionary counterculture, anti-establishment, almost anarchist in terms of spiritual revolution. Yet, instead of recognizing this example he set, modern people are going backwards and really engaging what was added after the fact. So we can see how all of this, you know, all of this lends to the credence of a conspiracy theory that it's all most supposition, assumption, wishful thinking, which is fine, But now more than ever in this world, we need to rest upon and stand upon only what we know is true for ourselves. Period. I don't teach Buddhism. I teach sharing of my own journey in Buddhism. That's all any of us can teach. Everything else is theory. Just because a teacher says it's so doesn't make it so. Right? I can only share what I've learned, my wisdom and insight from my own experience, and I share that with nothing attached to it in the sense of you don't have to believe it, you don't have to adopt it, and you could be completely polar opposite of that. But for me to say you're wrong, and for you to say I'm wrong, is being completely in the delusion and illusion of a theory. And that doesn't serve anybody's well-being. So I don't know if this was helpful. I hope it was. Buddha said, find your own way, carve your own path, be a light unto yourself, right? Let go of what doesn't work, engage what does work. Now, this isn't a license to do whatever the fuck you want. Of course not. There's an ethical and moral aspect to this practice that is actually more important than any other aspect, right? I don't care how many verses of sacred literature you can memorize and how many characters in sacred literature you can name and tell their stories. I don't care how well you can do a ritual. I don't care if you know every holiday on the calendar. And it doesn't matter. To me, that's not what's important, right? What's important is the ethical and virtuous, wholesome, healthy practice that I engage in based on my own truth that is concluded from my own experience. And if everyone did that, not just in their spiritual practice, but in every aspect of life, life would be simple. Extremely simple. So I'll leave you with a Zen koan. The way is not difficult if we're not attached to our picking and choosing, our preference and judgment. Doesn't mean we don't have them. We're unique individuals with our own preferences and judgments, discernments, interests. If we're not attached to them, we can rise above the conspiracy, the theories, the rigid and fixed component that traps us. So I just went on a little further, but I tend to free associate and keep going. And I'm going to end it there. Have a great maggot-free day above the dirt. Peace out.